Hello, everybody. Okay, time for culture and gender bias. uh, in the issues and debates topic, but is more an issue than a debate. I think there's no debate really. We shouldn't be having culture bias in our research. We shouldn't be biasing against genders or sexes. Absolutely not. So this is more an issue more than a debate. Quite a terminological bullet point we have here with us today. Not the easiest debate, or well, not even a debate as I've covered, but not the easiest issue in debate. I think there's a lot of terminology, so let's make a start on it. There are a lot of key terms, so to both gender bias and culture bias. These are key terms to add. Some of them are probably harder to wrap your head around than others. The first one we are looking at here is this concept of universality. What we mean by universal behaviors is basically a behavior that can be applied to every single human on this planet, regardless of gender, regardless of culture. What behaviors do we have that apply to everybody? And the one that always people say is breathing, but it's not really a behavior, is it? Not from a psychological point of view. Can you think of any psychological behaviors that apply to everybody? So if you might, some of you might consider to say depression. Well, not really, because depression doesn't really appear in some small cultures. It's not really a thing. There is certainly a cultural element to depression. In genders, obviously, it's rarer in one gender than the other, or technically sex, but there aren't many. One that I do think applies to all of us is fight or flight. So fight or flight generally does apply to most humans, whether you fight a threat or flee from one, or freeze as well. But universal behaviors, known as universality, is generally quite rare. But again, the important thing to note, I think, from universality is its behavior that exists despite gender or culture. You have ethnocentrism, right? So this is more of a cultural thing, something to note down, which is now this is a bit of a vague term, I think, but inappropriately generalizing the values, inappropriately generalizing the values and research findings of one culture to another without bothering to test that culture. What's quite important here is I'm going to also go through a couple of terms that sound very similar, but the key thing to take away from this is that actually ethnocentrism is about when you generalize the results. So slightly different to what I'm going to go through. Cultural relativism is something we do aim for. So it's a belief that you need to consider the behavior being studied in the context that it's in. So, for example, some behaviors are affected by cultural norms that need to be studied within that culture. So if you're looking at, I don't know, the German concept of independence, and how that affects how German parents raise their kids, you cannot study that from afar. You have to go to Germany. You have to embed yourself in the culture. You have to work with German researchers, for example. Why is that important? If you go to Germany as a British person, you are going to see things from a British point of view. You will not be able to escape your Britishisms. You will not be able to escape your norms, for example. And you would look at everything that the Germans are doing and go, no, mighty, that's bloody weird. Whereas the reason why you have to work with German researchers is to allow them to try to contextualize the behaviors that you are seeing. So cultural relativism is something that we do look for. It's something that we do want. There are a couple of obvious ones, though, and this is where I find students start to get quite good at evaluations, because they take things like androcentrism, alpha bias, and beta bias, and they use them very, very well. So let's start with the first one there. So in the first year, you are taught about androcentrism being, male-dominated samples, but it's not just that, really. Androcentrism is actually a much wider term. Androcentrism is actually, yes, it's a male focus in research, but really, androcentrism is the assumption that male behavior is normal, the baseline from which you compare from. So if you were to, I don't know, look at aggression and say, okay, well, males are aggressive. Absolutely, males are aggressive. But to see that level of aggressiveness as the norm, so that when you look at women and go, oh, they are less aggressive. No, it's not a case of less aggressive or more aggressive. So androcentrism is the assumption that male behavior is the norm. Now, the next two terms I want you to, if you haven't already, I want you to start using a bit more in your evaluations, because here is the beauty of what I'm about to go through. Any theory you look at is either alpha bias or beta bias. Now, I'll go through alpha bias first, right? So this is a theory. Alpha bias is when a theory potentially over-exaggerates the differences between men and women. And it says that men are this and women are this, and there is a clear difference between them. Now, men and women are different. Anatomically, we're different. Chromosomally, we're different. And behaviorally, we are different. That's not to say one's better than the other. Absolutely not. But we are different. But is there a chance that these theories are potentially over-exaggerating? Now, what I want you to do from now on is such a critical point. Anytime a theory clearly states a difference between men and women, anything in attachment, for example, the first bullet point of relationships, where we look at how men want sex with everything and women want to be quite protective of an egg, so they're quite choosy, quite picky. Anytime we state that, I would want you to criticize that theory for potentially having alpha bias. Now, please note this down. You need to know the consequences of an alpha biased theory. If a theory is saying that men are this and women are that, I want you to elaborate and say that creates stereotypes, that creates prejudices that each sex is then held to. For example, if a male sleeps around because of this evolutionary theory, well done, well done. That's how you're supposed to act. Whereas if a female sleeps around, which is her right, by the way, her full right, then the theory is making us culture look at that as a bad thing. Oh, that's not very women-like and all this crap, basically. So the problem with an alpha bias theory is that, yes, it accepts that it says that men and women are different, and we probably are different. But the problem with it is it creates stereotypes from which we then have to live by. So, this whole thing about, females are supposed to be more nurturing. Well, what happens if a male is actually quite nurturing, right? You might be criticized for being quite feminine, for example, which is not a bad thing at all. So, but you may be criticized for it. So there are a bit of issues with alpha bias, but in reality, there aren't actually that many alpha bias theories that we look at. Where you're much more likely going to find easy criticism is in the beta or beta or peta or tomato or potato or the beta bias, basically, where actually, and this applies to most theories we look at. Two-process model, for example, faulty caudate nucleus causing OCD, any genetic theory, schizophrenic mother, which actually is technically kind of alpha bias, I guess, but in that case, dopamine hypothesis, family dysfunction. Most theories we look at could be criticised for having beta bias, and that is essentially when a theory doesn't actually clearly state any sex differences, despite there possibly being sex differences. So beta bias can be I know I'm spending a lot of time on this because it is quite important, but beta bias can be criticised, or any beta bias theory can be criticised because it probably isn't valid, or at most, it is valid for one of the sexes, probably male. And therefore, at most, you're only getting a valid theory for 50% of the population. So beta bias is when the differences between men and women are minimalized, they are underplayed. If a theory does not clearly state there is a difference between men and women, one of the evaluations is you say it could be criticized for beta bias, and give an example. Therefore, as a result, the theory probably isn't adequately explaining this behavior for both sexes, and that actually, for it to improve validity, to improve its validity, to improve the accuracy of the theory, it needs to go away and it needs to state these differences a little bit more. Now, a lot of these are a bit of culture, a bit of gender. The next few are actually culture issues. So you need to know emic and etic approaches to research. So an emic approach to research refers to research that aims to study human behavior in one culture without applying that behavior elsewhere. Now, that is obviously a good thing, right? So an emic approach is probably quite an admirable approach. Refers to research that aims to study behavior in one culture without applying that behavior elsewhere. If you've watched the ideographic nomothetic approach, the emic approach is a bit ideographic, if that makes sense. Hopefully you can make that link, because the emic research is saying, no, I want to look at this target population and I'm only going to apply it to the results I find to this target population, without then making nomothetic laws elsewhere. And etic research is a little bit different, a little bit more nomothetic, I guess. But an etic approach looks at behavior from the outside of a given culture and attempts to find trends that can be generalized, such as universal behaviors. Now, that's less good. It's assuming universal behaviors, when let's face it, culture really does impact our behavior, people. But one thing to also make a link to is etic approaches often lead to imposed ethics. Now, imposed ethics is when a behavior is assumed to apply to other cultures, assumed to apply to other cultures, so is inappropriately applied. The classic example, which I would like you to bracket after writing this, is Ainsworth's attachment types. So secure, insecure, avoidant, insecure, resistant. All of those are based upon American norms of raising kids that Ainsworth created and researched. She then thought, well, clearly all countries raise their babies this way. Clearly all countries have these same types. Clearly all countries have secure, avoidant and resistant kids. So clearly all countries I'm going to apply this to. And it's so wrong, right? It's so wrong. So imposed ethics, not a good thing. That's a bad Ainsworth. So let's start with culture bias. We've looked at a lot of the key terms here, but let's start with culture bias. That is a definition of generally what culture bias is. It is the act of interpreting or judging behavior of one culture by holding them to the standards of your own. Let me give you an example. I would like to take you all to a Greek island, in a non-weird way, I should say, right? I mean, like imaginatively. And we're all walking down a high street on a nice high street on a Greek island of loads of restaurants. And outside, you've got a lot of the proprietors of the restaurant owners, who are quite aggressively trying to get you into their restaurant. And they're trying to hoard you. They're trying to hoard us into their restaurant. Come in, the best lamb koftas and all this stuff, right? Now, whenever I go away and I see that, I always think, how dare they? How dare they try to get us in their restaurant, like force us in their restaurant to take our money? This is ridiculous. It would never happen in Britain. The reason for that story is to show you it's almost impossible to step away from your own culture. Even if you go to another culture and study another culture, it's almost impossible to step away from your own culture. You are constantly judging that culture based on your own culture. So you are going to be, generally speaking, a British person doing research in, say, Bosnia is going to take their British culture with them and judge that Bosnian culture according to their British culture, which, there's no one right culture. So, loads of examples. Ainsworth is by far the easiest, to be honest with you. Ainsworth is by far the easiest. There are a couple of examples, though. Ainsworth at the top, obviously. Why am I yawning? Oh, Candy's back. Factors that cause culture bias. So I'm just going to go back to welcome my pregnant girlfriend back, because I probably need to say hello to her. 1 second. Sorry, I'm back. So ethnocentrism causes culture bias. If you're looking to elaborate that in a quote, that is the direction you want actually to put them in. So ethnocentrism causes culture bias. Cultural relativism also can cause culture bias if you are not culturally relative. So as it says, that all cultures are equally worthy of respect, and we should understand how other cultures view the world. And in order to do that, we need to be culturally relative. If we're not, we're culture bias. So again, just maybe draw some of these arrows about what is causing what. And a good example of this is from 2003 to 2007. It's very different nowadays, but 93% of the studies in the top 6 psychological journals were from westernized countries. Why is that bad? It means that the West is setting the norm for what they think behavior is. We are speaking to Asian countries and Asiatic countries and Oceanic countries, African countries, South American countries, and we're saying this is what we think is normal behavior. And if you're different to that, then you are abnormal. And thus they view the other cultures as abnormal. I guess for those who do politics and history, it's a good way of saying that it's a good way of the West showing they have good soft power. If you do politics or history, hopefully you know what I'm on about when I talk about that. But it's the Western approach to maybe a little bit of soft power dominance. Don't worry if you don't get that. It's not particularly important, really. So, gender bias. Now, that's a very, very basic run through, by the way, of what we are talking about. But gender bias is essentially, this is when a bias is made towards one gender, behavior is then applied to that gender, and it's typically caused by just studying one gender. Now, that doesn't tend to happen nowadays. That doesn't tend to happen. But before the 1980s, women were generally not deemed worthy of researching, and so they just researched men, and then the male behavior is deemed as normal, and then it was just inappropriately applied to women. So androcentrism, we have covered that. Alpha bias, we have covered that as well as beta bias, as well as a voice note in there for you. But in terms of what studies can be seen as androcentric, there's a lot. And by the way, it's not just because these behaviors had male samples. It's just the assumption that all the behavior that was shown is the norm, and therefore it was inappropriately applied to women. For example, Milgram looking at males and saying, "Oh, this is how people obey, not this is how males obey." He then just applied his findings to women, and it's completely inappropriate. And if you don't believe me, have a look at the obedience rates in Sheridan and King's research. Where they pretended to shock a dead puppy. Women obeyed more in that case. So there is a difference. In terms of evaluations, to be honest, I need to update these slides a little bit, I think. But not all behaviours need to be researched in different cultures. Some are universal, but some are not universal. In fact, most behaviours are not universal, and they need to be studied. Now, what you need to do when you elaborate it is you need to be eloquent on the point of how important that is, how important it is that we need to go into other people's cultures to see what is normal and what isn't normal. If you want to elaborate on that, then you would say we run the risk of gaining an invalid understanding of the complexity of human behavior across different cultures. If we just randomly say, oh, yeah, New Zealand culture is very different to Papua New Guinean culture, for example, it's completely wrong. Culture plays a very dominant part in our behavior. Easy to elaborate on this, right? Now, remember, cannot stress this enough. A theory could be criticized for being either alpha or beta bias. So outside of this issue, outside of this issue and debate topic, you want to use that quite a lot, definitely. And you also need to these two words here. You need to have a good understanding about how these biases can affect society, even nowadays. We're talking about this evolutionary theory about men being able to sleep with as many people as they want, whereas women have to be more selective. That still is a problem nowadays. So it's a huge issue. So in terms of exam questions that come up, not that many have come up in this topic before. We've got them all just here. So you got a STEM one just there. This one quite easy. Outline one problem associated with alpha bias in research and one problem associated with beta bias in research. So you might want to define them, what they are. Alpha bias is when over exaggerates, and this leads to prejudice or stereotypes, for example. And one problem associated with beta bias is that it minimizes the differences between sexes, which could lead to invalid conclusions and an erroneous assumption that male and female behavior is the same when actually we're quite different. As I go through, there's a couple of there's a 3 marker there. There's another 3 marker. There's multiple choice just here, and then you get to this one down the bottom right here, 2021. Look at this question. Discuss gender bias in psychological research. Refer to one topic you've studied in your answer. It's an 8 marker. AO1 is 3, AO2 is 2, and AO3 is 3. Now, if I'm going to go through this and answer this question, you need to outline gender bias. So in this case, I would talk about alpha bias, beta bias, give examples, maybe define gender bias in general. Refer to maybe anything you've looked at. So literally you could pick Milgram and criticize it for being beta bias. You could look at evolutionary partner preferences, that first bullet point in relationships, and say that's alpha bias, for example. Look at attachment, that's alpha bias. And then you want to evaluate it. So in terms of your evaluation, how do you evaluate gender bias in research? One peel. And in this case, I would definitely go for something along the lines of how important it is that we get it right. How important it is that we don't create gender bias, and how socially sensitive it is. And that's your point, by the way. Your point should start off and say that gender bias is incredibly socially sensitive. One of the first things I'm going to do after this screencast, which I'm going to end in about 20 seconds, is to redo these slides. So my advice would be to go onto my resource site and have a look through the slides at how improved they are, because I'm definitely going to just revisit some of that. I'm not very happy with it, but hopefully you've got the main gist. That is everything you need to know. Have a look at these questions, maybe attempt this 8 marker, but I hope, as always, it was useful.